In this video, we're going to be looking at reflexes and reflex arcs. So this is chapter 13, part 6. So the second way the spinal cord promotes homeostasis is by serving as an integration center for some reflexes. So a reflex is a really fast, involuntary, and unplanned sequence of events that occurs in response to a particular stimulus. So some reflexes are inborn, such as pulling your hand away from a hot surface before you can even feel that it's hot, while other reflexes are learned or acquired. For instance, you can actually learn many reflexes while acquiring driving experience. Slamming on the brakes in an emergency is an example of this. So here you can actually click on this link for a playable animation on reflexes. When integration takes place in the spinal cord gray matter, the reflex is a spinal reflex. Now, an example of this would be your patellar reflex, otherwise known as your knee-jerk reflex. If integration occurs in the brainstem rather than the spinal cord, the reflex is called a cranial reflex. An example of a cranial reflex would be the eye tracking movements that happen when you read. You're probably aware of somatic reflexes, which involve the contraction of skeletal muscles. Equally important, however, would be the autonomic reflexes, or the visceral reflexes, which generally are not consciously perceived. Nerve impulses propagate into, through, and out of the central nervous system. They follow very specific pathways, depending on the kind of information, its origin, and its destination. The pathway that's followed by nerve impulses that produces a reflex, this is called a reflex arc. So here in this picture, we have an example of a reflex arc. So first, we have a stimulus that is perceived by a sensory receptor. For example, pain here when you get a nail in the skin like this is perceived by these sensory receptors in the skin and sends information to the spinal cord by these sensory neurons. So we have the axon conducting impulses through that sensory neuron to the interneuron, which is going to be the integrating center, sorry. And that integrating center, the interneuron, will then synapse with a motor neuron, and this will conduct impulses from the integrating center to the effector, which is a muscle or gland, deciding what to do. So if you step on a nail, you're going to have a reflex that you tear your foot away from that pain that is sensed, and that's a very quick reflex. Here are some terms that we need to familiarize ourselves with. First, we have ipsilateral reflex arcs, and these are reflexes in which the response occurs on the same side of the body that is stimulated. So we have, well, actually here we'll do this. We'll have a stimulation and then a response. These are on the same side of the body. Contralateral reflex arcs, these are reflexes in which the response occurs on the opposite side of the body that is stimulated. So stimulation and the response are going to be on opposite sides. This is contralateral. A monosynaptic reflex arc is the simplest form of reflex arc, and this is where the integrating center is actually the synapse between a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron. So we just have one synapse, which is what monosynaptic means, one synapse. All monosynaptic reflexes are going to be ipsilateral. Next, we have polysynaptic reflex arcs, and these involve more than two types of neurons and more than one central nervous system synapse. So Poly meaning more than one, so we're going to have more than one synapse. And these can be ipsilateral or contralateral. Next, reciprocal innervation. This is an arrangement where the components of a neural circuit will simultaneously cause contraction of one muscle and relaxation of its antagonists. So we see reciprocal innervation, for example, when you walk and you extend your leg forward, you're going to have contraction of your quadriceps muscles and relaxation of your hamstring muscles in order to allow your foot to extend. So this is the stretch reflex, and this causes contraction of a skeletal muscle in response to stretching of the muscle. So this type of reflex occurs by a monosynaptic reflex arc. And you can see that right here. The main arc that we're going to see is going to be this one right here. So this integrating center here that we're going to have attached to the contracting muscle. So a slight stretching of the muscle spindles, or a slight stretching of the muscle, stimulates these sensory receptors that are called muscle spindles. So the muscle spindles are actually going to be the sensory receptors detecting that stretch in the muscle. And these spindles actually directly monitor changes in the length of the muscle. Now, in response to being stretched, a muscle spindle generates one or more nerve impulses that will propagate along this sensory neuron. They will be integrated here at the monosynaptic reflex arc there. And then we will go to the effector here, which is actually the same muscle contracting to actually relieve that stretching that was detected by the muscle spindles. As you can see, this is an ipsilateral reflex. You can see the middle of the spinal cord here, and it all stays on this side of the spinal cord, so it's on the same side incoming and same side outgoing. So it's ipsilateral. And you can also see that reciprocal innervation is also at work in this reflex as well. So with this reciprocal innervation, we also see that the sensory neuron will synapse with an inhibitory interneuron. So you can see here, and that inhibitory neuron will actually cause these antagonistic muscles to relax because they're going to be inhibited. And this causes the foot or the leg to rather extend. The stretch reflex operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle length by causing muscle contraction. Now, in contrast, we have the tendon reflex, and this operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation before muscle force becomes so great that the tendons might actually be torn. Tendon reflex is quite a bit more sensitive than the stretch reflex, but it can easily override the stretch reflex when the tension is really great in that tendon, and this will actually make you drop a heavy weight, for example. Now, just like the stretch reflex, the tendon reflex is going to be ipsilateral, and the sensory receptors that are going to be here in the tendon, these are called Golgi tendon organs, or sometimes just simply called tendon organs. So here you can see in this diagram, the tension, increased tension in the tendon is going to be detected by these Golgi tendons, or the tendon organs, and that information is going to go through or via the sensory organ, or this via the sensory neuron, to the spinal cord. And here we're going to synapse with two different interneurons, the inhibitory interneuron and an excitatory interneuron. So to keep that stretching, or that tendon from having too much force on it, we're actually going to relax the muscle that the tendon is attached to. So it's going to relieve that excess tension there. Then the excitatory interneuron is going to actually cause the antagonistic muscles to contract. So this will actually cause, in this case, it will cause the foot, or the leg rather, to flex. A reflex involving a polysynaptic reflex arc occurs when, for instance, you step on a tack or a nail or something. Now, in response to such a painful stimulus, you immediately withdraw your leg. And this reflex is called a flexor or withdrawal reflex. And there is more steps than in the prior reflexes than we've talked about. So just like the other reflexes though, this is an ipsilateral reflex, so it occurs on the same side that the stimulus comes on. Because nerve impulses from one sensory neuron ascend and descend in the spinal cord to activate interneurons in several segments of the spinal cord, in this case, this type of reflex is called an intersegmental reflex arc. So as you can see here, we have this sensory neuron that is going to bring this information to the spinal cord that you stepped on a tack. The sensory receptor detected this pain here in the foot. And so we're going to be bringing that information here to this level of the spinal cord. Now, because this is an intersegmental reflex arc, so this single sensory neuron can activate several sensory neurons, stimulating more than one effector. So we're going to affect more than one muscle group. So here we're going to have an interneuron that will go to a different segment of the spinal cord, and here as well, activating these motor neurons here to activate different muscle groups, so that we're going to have a very large flexion effector kind of a response. So that this happens very quickly and many muscle groups are activated. Something else might happen also when you step on a tack. So you might start to lose your balance as your body weight shifts to your other foot, to your left foot in this case. Now, besides initiating the flexor reflex that causes you to withdraw your limb, as we saw in the last slide, the pain impulses from stepping on the tack also cause this crossed extensor reflex. And this helps you to maintain your balance when you tear your foot away from that painful stimulus. Unlike the flexor reflex, which is an ipsilateral reflex, the crossed extensor reflex is a contralateral reflex. So sensory impulses enter from one side of the spinal cord. So these are going to be from this sensory neuron, as you can see here, from your right foot. Sensory neuron will come here into the spinal cord, and then we're going to synapse with these interneurons here, and these interneurons are going to cause action potentials in motor neurons on the opposite side of the spinal cord. So this crossed extensor reflex synchronizes the extension of the contralateral limb with the withdrawal of the ipsilateral stimulated limb. So what this means is that it's going to cause a contraction in your left leg so that you're going to extend it and be able to keep your balance while you are flexing and withdrawing your right leg from a pain stimulus. So this is a contralateral reflex that helps you to maintain your balance while you remove your other foot from a painful stimulus. And that's going to be the end of Chapter 13, Part 6.